9,000. Over 9,000 projectiles, ballistic missiles, cruise missiles, drones, rockets. Iran and its proxies launched them all, yet Israel still stands. Hamas is shattered, Hezbollah's leadership decimated, the Assad regime in Syria has collapsed, Iran's ring of fire is broken. The April barrage alone, roughly 300 drones and missiles, cost billions. The strategic objective, destroying Israel, dominating the region, remains as distant as ever. Instead of standing down, Tehran escalates. And within that arsenal, the ballistic missiles represent the crown jewel, the weapons Iran itself manufactures and fires from its own territory. During Operation True Promise 1 and 2, Tehran launched over 300 ballistic projectiles directly at Israel, the solid propellant K-bar with its roughly 1,500-kilometer range, and the Fatah, which Iran describes as hypersonic and claims can maneuver past sophisticated air defenses. Each of these missiles may cost between several $100,000 and over $1 million, a steep price for weapons that, in most cases, were intercepted by Arrow and David's sling batteries before reaching Israeli soil. Beyond the ballistic salvos, Iran deployed its growing fleet of cruise missiles and suicide drones. The Shahed 136 Delta Wing drone, cheap at $20,000 to $40,000 a unit, became the mass weapon of choice, fired in swarms by both Iranian forces and Houthi rebels in Yemen. These slow-moving munitions, packed with 40 kilos of explosives, flew programmed routes toward Israeli cities and energy infrastructure. Alongside them came the Pave cruise missile, a longer-range evolution of the Russian Kh-55, capable of skimming terrain at subsonic speeds to evade radar. But the bulk of the 9,000 projectiles originated not from Iran proper, but from the arc of proxies Tehran has armed, funded, and trained for decades. Hezbollah alone contributed over 8,000 rockets in 11 months, everything from short-range Katyusha barrages to the heavy Falak and Zelzal systems that struck as far south as Haifa. From Gaza, Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad launched thousands more, burying southern Israel under rocket salvos while attempting infiltration attacks. Iraqi militias added their own volleys, targeting U.S. bases and, increasingly, launching drones and cruise missiles toward Eilat. And the Houthis, controlling Sana'a and the northern Yemeni highlands, fired long-range Quds and Tufan missiles, choking Red Sea shipping while claiming solidarity with the Palestinian cause. This was no haphazard effort. It was a coordinated multi-front saturation campaign designed to overwhelm layered defenses and strike simultaneously from every compass point. No fix necessary. This is strategic commentary, not a verifiable factual claim. Behind that curtain of fire lay a sprawling proxy network decades in the making, stitched together by the Quds force of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. From Beirut to Sana'a, from Baghdad to Gaza, Tehran cultivated an axis of non-state actors, each a forward operating arm in a larger war of attrition. Hezbollah, the most formidable, received an annual budget of roughly $700 million, funds that transformed southern Lebanon into a fortress of tunnels, precision-guided missiles, and tens of thousands of rockets. Further south, Hamas and Islamic Jihad operated with Iranian-supplied blueprints, raw explosives, and technical training, turning Gaza's underground workshops into a production line for indigenous rockets. In Yemen, the Houthis were armed with long-range drones and anti-ship missiles, enabling them to choke the Bab el-Mandeb Strait and fire projectiles toward Eilat. Across Iraq, Kataib Hezbollah and other militias moved weapons and fighters along corridors once used by ISIS, now repurposed to shuttle ballistic missile components to Syria and Lebanon. The funding stream was equally diversified: oil smuggling, front companies, cryptocurrency transfers, and direct cash deliveries through Damascus and Beirut airports. Command and control, however, did not mean micromanagement. Iran set strategic objectives: encirclement, attrition, deterrence, but left operational decisions to local commanders who knew the terrain. This distributed model allowed rapid escalations, but it also created seams. Supply convoys crossing the Syrian desert, weapons caches in civilian neighborhoods, and communication relays on known frequencies. Each became a vulnerability waiting to be exploited. The very structure that enabled Iran to strike from multiple fronts simultaneously was the same structure that could unravel under sustained pressure. But behind this sprawling network lay a far more ambitious vision. Tehran's grand design was not merely about tactical harassment or border skirmishes. It was a strategy built on four pillars: the destruction of Israel, the expulsion of American influence from the Middle East, the domination of the region through a loyal proxy arc, and the breaking of economic sanctions via sustained military pressure. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps saw missile power and militia warfare as the keys to achieving all of this. They spent roughly 40 years and many billions of dollars building a forward defense network that stretched from Iran to the Mediterranean. The logic was simple: strangle Israel with a ring of fire from Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in Gaza, and Shia militias in Syria and Iraq. Bleed American forces with roadside bombs and drone strikes until Washington lost the will to stay. Coerce Gulf Arab states into submission and reorder the region's political map. And finally, use the constant threat of escalation to fracture the global sanctions regime, forcing Europe and Asia to choose between economic ties with Iran and solidarity with the West. In Tehran's calculations, the sheer volume of firepower would compensate for conventional military weaknesses. They built an arsenal of over 120,000 rockets and missiles across the proxy network, and the total expenditure of 9,000 projectiles in this current conflict, drones, cruise missiles, ballistic missiles, was merely the opening salvo in a long war of attrition. But against that opening salvo stood something Tehran had underestimated. Israel's multi-layered air defense system turned the sky into a wall of iron. Iron Dome intercepted short-range rockets from Gaza and Lebanon. David's Sling caught the medium-range missiles fired from Syria and Iraq. The Arrow system, designed for exo-atmospheric kills, swatted down Iranian ballistic missiles long before they could threaten Tel Aviv or Dimona. In two massive Iranian attacks, Operation True Promise in April and its sequel in October, roughly 400 ballistic missiles were launched. Most never reached their targets. The ones that did hit, like fragments near Nevatim Air Base, caused only superficial damage. This hardware was reinforced by a population drilled in civil resilience. Early warning sirens gave between 15 seconds and 3 minutes of alert. In that window, Israelis moved into bomb shelters, safe rooms, and stairwells across the country. School children and office workers alike knew the drill by heart. The psychological shock Tehran banked on simply did not materialize. Hospitals stayed open, ports remained functional, and daily life resumed within hours of each barrage. Underpinning it all was an intelligence network that stripped away surprise. Unit 8200 and Mossad had mapped the launch sites, supply lines, and command bunkers of the entire proxy network for years. Decoys were identified, missile trajectories calculated in real time. Coordinated Hezbollah barrages were blunted because Israel had already destroyed 1/3 of the group's launch pads in preemptive strikes during the northern campaign. In the south, the Houthis' long-range drones were tracked from Yemen, downed by Saudi and American assets, or simply lost in the vast empty desert. The 9,000 projectiles spent so far did not produce a decisive blow. They fractured against a system built to absorb exactly this kind of storm. But behind each projectile that fell short, a deeper toll was already being extracted inside Iran, not in lives lost, but in treasure consumed. Each Shahed 136 drone, cheap by Western standards, still costs roughly $20,000 to produce. Multiply that by the thousands launched, and the bill climbs into the hundreds of millions. A single Fateh 110 ballistic missile runs closer to $500,000. The Ahmad and Shahab 3 variants, with their longer range and larger warheads, push well past that. By conservative estimates, Iran's direct missile and drone expenditure in this conflict has already burned through over $4 billion. That figure does not include the rockets and launchers supplied to Hezbollah, Hamas, and Iraqi militias, which add another $2 to $3 billion to the ledger. The money vanishes while Iran's own currency collapses. The rial has lost nearly 90% of its value against the dollar in 6 years. Inflation runs above 40%. Bread, medicine, and fuel are rationed in cities like Isfahan and Mashhad. Strikes by bazaar merchants and pensioners erupt with growing regularity, met by security forces. The regime funnels hard currency into missile factories and Revolutionary Guard bases, while ordinary Iranians queue for hours to buy subsidized chicken. This is not a superpower spending from surplus. It is a country under suffocating sanctions, bleeding its reserves to sustain a campaign that has not shifted the strategic map. The burning treasure fuels domestic rage, not victory. Yet the proxy network that was meant to multiply this firepower has revealed its own deep fractures. Hezbollah, the crown jewel of Iran's forward defense, has moved with visible caution. Despite an arsenal of roughly 150,000 rockets, its cross-border strikes remain calibrated, rarely breaching Israel's deeper urban centers. The group fears a full-scale war that could dismantle its military infrastructure in southern Lebanon, a risk Tehran cannot afford. It fires, but it does not unleash. From Yemen, the Houthis launch drones and ballistic missiles toward Israel's southern port of Eilat. The distance stretches roughly 2,000 kilometers, giving air defenses ample time to intercept most projectiles. Their attacks generate headlines, not strategic damage. The geography that once made them a persistent threat to Saudi Arabia now dilutes their impact against Israel. Hamas, the spark that ignited this cycle, has been systematically decimated. Its rocket brigades in Gaza are shattered. Its tunnel networks collapsed under relentless bombardment. The group that once fired barrages of hundreds is now reduced to sporadic, single-digit salvos. Its military wing can no longer impose costs at scale. Iraqi militias, operating under names like Kataib Hezbollah, launch one-way drones toward Haifa and Eilat, but their effectiveness is marginal. Most are shot down by U.S. or Israeli interceptors before crossing the border. Their strikes are a nuisance, not a lever. Each proxy, constrained by its own survival calculus or physical limits, fails to converge into a coherent, decisive front. But this nuisance has a price. Every volley invites a counterpunch that lands deeper inside Iran's own network. When Tehran launched over 300 missiles and drones at Israel in April 2024, the retaliation was surgical and immediate. An Israeli strike on an S-300 radar site near Isfahan sent a clear message: your air defense umbrella is permeable. In Damascus, a precision hit on the Iranian consulate annex had already killed 2 senior Quds Force commanders, Mohammad Reza Zahedi and his deputy. These are not peripheral losses, they are the architects of proxy warfare. The pattern repeats with each escalation. After Hezbollah's massive rocket salvos from southern Lebanon, Israeli jets systematically dismantle launch sites and weapons depots, often minutes after the outgoing fire. U.S. naval destroyers in the Red Sea intercept Houthi drones and then degrade radar stations along Yemen's coast. In Iraq, airstrikes on Kataib Hezbollah facilities follow every attack on U.S. bases, cratering logistics hubs near Al-Qaim. The cumulative degradation is measurable. Iran loses command nodes, precision guidance kits, and the very deniability its strategy depends on. Tehran responds not by standing down, but by digging deeper into a hole. It pushes more advanced systems to proxies, Shahed 136 drones, only to see them destroyed, yet they have already altered the battlefield equation in Ukraine. The strategic goal of expelling U.S. forces and dismantling Israel recedes. Instead, Iran is locked in a reactive posture, absorbing damage that weakens its long-term deterrence. The spiral tightens. Each attack designed to project strength actually exposes vulnerability, forcing the next, more desperate launch. The proxy front becomes a trap, draining resources and accelerating the very retaliation it was meant to prevent. But within Tehran's corridors, the calculation shifts from battlefield to throne room. The missile salvos are not merely tactical. They are a spectacle, broadcast across state television to drown out the rumble of discontent. When the currency collapses and protests erupt over bread prices, a firing battery outside Isfahan becomes the regime's loudest spokesperson. The same rockets that level buildings in Tel Aviv are repackaged at home as proof of divine strength. Parades in Azadi Square replay the launches, turning distant explosions into a televised shield for a leadership whose approval ratings have withered under sanctions. This logic also binds the proxy network. Hezbollah commanders in Beirut and Houthi spokesmen in Sana'a likely monitor many launches closely. They need to see Tehran's trigger finger twitch, to believe the patron will bleed alongside them. So each drone sent from Kermanshah is a signal, a costly demonstration that the supply lines remain open, the patronage intact. Ceasing fire would be read as desertion, unraveling decades of influence stretching from Deir ez-Zor to the Red Sea. And underneath, the state masks its own fractures. Power cuts cripple Tehran, water shortages ignite riots in Khuzestan, yet the narrative of resistance endures. Escalation becomes the anesthetic, the only language a regime with roughly 40% inflation and a restive youth bulge can use to shout down the admission that its grand project is failing. So the volleys continue, not to win, but to pretend. But in the diplomatic arena, the strategy has backfired dramatically. Each Iranian missile launch has acted as a powerful recruiting tool for its adversaries. Nations that were once hesitant are now openly aligning against Tehran. The attacks have accelerated a historic realignment in the Middle East, quietly pushing Arab states like Saudi Arabia closer to Israel, united by a common threat. This normalization, once a slow diplomatic process, is now gaining urgent momentum. Simultaneously, Western military cooperation has deepened. The United States and European allies have solidified defensive pacts and intelligence sharing, creating a more formidable coalition in the region. Iran finds itself increasingly isolated, not strengthened, on the world stage. Traditional partners remain cautious, while new sanctions tighten. The regime's show of force, intended to project dominance, has instead underscored its geopolitical loneliness. This isolation undermines Iran's long-term position, making its economy more vulnerable and its strategic options narrower. The very attacks meant to demonstrate reach have galvanized a broader, more determined alliance against it, proving that hard power alone cannot manufacture respect or security. And so the calculation fails. The intended message of overwhelming force instead broadcasts a critical weakness. Each time Iran or its proxies launch a massive barrage, whether from Yemen, Iraq, Lebanon, or its own soil, it establishes a red line, and each time its adversaries, principally Israel and the United States, step over that line. The Houthis fire, international navies shoot down their drones, Hezbollah escalates, Israel strikes deeper into Lebanon, Iran itself launches a historic direct attack. It is met with a sophisticated and humiliating interception by a coalition of allies, followed by a calibrated but unmistakable Israeli counterstrike on Iranian soil. The pattern is clear. The more Iran fires, the less it deters. Its vast arsenal, once a source of menacing ambiguity, is now a measured and manageable variable in its enemy's war plans. This repeated crossing of its declared thresholds exposes a profound strategic impotence. It emboldens adversaries to act with greater confidence, knowing the response will be noisy but ultimately containable. The erosion of deterrence is perhaps the most dangerous outcome of this expenditure. It invites further testing, pushing Iran into a cycle where it must escalate simply to maintain a facade of credibility, all while its actual security diminishes. The attacks meant to project invincibility have instead painted a target, revealing not an untouchable power, but a frustrated one whose biggest weapons have failed to deliver their promised terror. That frustration now hardens into something far more dangerous. The regime in Tehran faces a narrowing strategic corridor with no visible exit. Backing down, even slightly, is no longer a simple adjustment. It would be read in Beirut, Sana'a, and Gaza as abandonment, a signal that the patron is weak and the decades-long project of the axis of resistance is hollow. Domestically, the ideology that keeps the state afloat rests entirely on defiance. A retreat would fracture that narrative, opening space for internal pressure that the clerical system is not built to endure. So the regime sees little alternative but to keep firing, even as the returns diminish. The numbers reveal the grim arithmetic. Each intercepted salvo drives up the cost of the bluff. A Shahed 136 drone might be cheap, but the total campaign across Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and the direct barrages from Iranian soil has consumed hardware worth hundreds of millions of dollars, from precision-guided Fateh missiles to naval strike drones, all spent to achieve largely symbolic rather than strategic effects. The Houthis continue to threaten shipping despite American warships intercepting projectiles and launching counterstrikes, because a ceasefire without Iranian backing would cost them their logistical and political lifeline. Hezbollah, reeling from Israeli battlefield takedowns and pager attacks, still launches rockets because its entire reason for being is tied to Iran's deterrence myth. To stop is to admit that the April volley of over 300 aerial threats was a failure. that the follow-up ballistic strike on October 1st broke against Arrow interceptors with only marginal impact, and that the supposedly fearsome arsenal cannot alter the regional balance. Yet the trajectory continues upward. Each cycle of escalation draws a sharper riposte, depleting missile stocks that take years to replenish, exposing airspace that foreign jets now penetrate at will, and inviting economic pressure that further tightens the noose. Iran has no off-ramp precisely because the ramp was built on a narrative of unstoppable power. Calling off the attacks would betray the very proxies whose suffering it demands. It would also confirm what adversaries already suspect, that the Islamic Republic is a frustrated actor whose biggest weapons have delivered no real shift in the battlefield. Caught in that logic, the leadership escalates because not escalating looks even worse, a losing spiral from which no face-saving path exists. The losing spiral has now drawn a line in the ledger. Over this conflict, Iran and its proxy network have expended roughly 9,000 standoff weapons. These include Fateh 110 and Zulfiqar ballistic missiles, Shahed 136 one-way attack drones, and thousands of shorter-range rockets. Hezbollah fired precision-guided munitions from southern Lebanon into northern Israel. The Houthis launched drone and cruise missile swarms targeting Red Sea shipping and Saudi infrastructure. Iraqi Kataib Hezbollah struck American positions with Grad rockets. Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired barrages from Gaza. The logistical chain stretches from Iranian factories to underground depots in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. Estimated costs run into several $billion, money drained from an economy under heavy sanctions. And yet, after all this firepower, Iran's declared objectives appear largely unmet. Israel's military and intelligence apparatus has not collapsed. The United States still garrisons bases across the region. No Arab capital has shifted alignment to Tehran's axis. The Houthi naval disruption failed to halt the Gaza war on Iran's terms. Hezbollah's Radwan commandos, trained for cross-border assault, lie buried or scattered after relentless Israeli air campaigns. By standard military measures, this is a poor return on investment. But the Iranian strategic calculus does not read like a Western balance sheet. Success is measured in endurance, in the very ability to fire in volume without being annihilated. Each missile launch drains the air defense magazines of adversaries. Each drone keeps an enemy state on edge. Attrition is not an accident. It is the design. The doctrine envisions a war of decades, not days. Still, the price at home is staggering. Protests erupt over soaring bread prices while ballistic missiles fly toward distant deserts. The regime maintains its survival, but the question, at what cost, arguably hangs heavier with every launch.